Well, good morning. Good morning. Ni hao. Are we ready in the translation booth? Okay. If anybody does need translation, there are earphones. So we'll give people a minute to get their earphones settled. Okay. Very good. Well, my name is Richard Kurin. I'm the Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture here at the Smithsonian, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you on a summer morning in Washington at the Smithsonian and this museum, the National Museum of Natural History. It's wonderful that you've all gathered from our colleagues from China, from Kenya, Senegal. I think we'll be joined perhaps by colleagues from Cuba and South Africa as well. And of course from different organizations across the United States and a lot of old friends as well. We do this, we gather today during the time of the annual Smithsonian Folklife Festival on the National Mall of the United States. And the festival is a great time to gather to explore the issues of intangible cultural heritage because it's this wonderful exposition of intangible cultural heritage, living cultural heritage, living folklore and folklife that we celebrate every year in the United States and at the Smithsonian. And so if we have any questions about what intangible cultural heritage is, all we have to do is step out the front door of this museum or the back door of this museum, as the case may be, and see it on the mall every day. This particular conference grows out of our involvement this year with the festival, with our Chinese colleagues, our collaborators in China who worked on festival and related aspects of research, as well as our colleagues from Kenya who are here in full force as well. It was 15 years ago today at the Smithsonian, June 30th, 1999, that the Smithsonian joined together with UNESCO and colleagues from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Humanities, the State Department, and others to host a conference on traditional cultural heritage. That conference in 1999 was held with UNESCO. Now, at that time, the United States was not a member of UNESCO. We left. Nevertheless, the Smithsonian sponsored with UNESCO that conference. We had representatives from 24 nations, and we had spokespeople and practitioners, cultural practitioners and exemplars from various communities around the world. And it was in the end that that conference called for a convention, a UNESCO convention on intangible cultural heritage. Some of the people who were there at that time who were instrumental in organizing that conference and that effort, I look at my friend and colleague Tony Seeger, who was at that time the director of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, worked very closely with Norika Akawa from the Intangible Cultural Heritage section of UNESCO. And the conference was co-hosted by Munir Bushnaki, who is the Assistant Director General for Culture, who shepherded through with Noriko that treaty. I see other fellows here, Barry Burgee from the National Endowment for the Arts that helped draft that treaty, Diane Njai, James Early, and others from the Smithsonian who helped craft some of the definitions and the provisions that led to that treaty. And now that Intangible Cultural Heritage Treaty has been adopted, I think now it's over 150 nations. So really on the way to universal acceptance. The U.S., it's still a struggle. We're still battling that battle. And the U.S., again, is in an interesting point with regard to its membership in UNESCO. Nevertheless, let me assure my colleagues, both American and international, that the Smithsonian is deeply interested, deeply, deeply interested. This is a matter of Smithsonian interest that goes back almost to our founding as an institution 168 years ago, that we are deeply interested in the cultural traditions of humankind, in documenting them, understanding them, and seeing that they persevere. With that treaty was important to me, and the conference in 1999 and the continuing concern about intangible cultural heritage. To me, it came out of kind of three strains, and one was a genuine appreciation of the varied and diverse cultures of the planet. You know, why? Why do we care about cultural traditions on the planet? Well, because we kind of appreciate people singing their songs, dancing their dances, making their foods, producing their craftsmanship and artistry. We appreciate it. And so that is, I think a thing that when you go out to the Folklife Festival on the Mall and you see people from across the United States or across the world, and they know very little about Maasai culture, for example, but they're out on the Mall, they'll sit for an hour, they'll watch, they'll appreciate, and maybe they learn something. And I think that's the second thing, is that we hope not only that appreciation, aesthetic appreciation of another's tradition attracts and engages one, but we also hope that people learn from the traditional knowledge and wisdom that reposes in the different cultural traditions of the planet. There is knowledge and wisdom built up over generations, over millennium, and I think the fact that we can learn from each other is something that we want to continue to do, and we don't want to discard so easily. And then I'd say finally the treaty had, to me, another strong purpose, which it grew out of really a sense of human rights and respect for people's culture, that people have the right to be who they culturally are, and they should benefit from who they culturally are, and that no one should close the door on somebody else's culture and say that it's not worthwhile, or it's not advanced, or it's not modern, or it's not appropriate, or it should go and blow off in the wind, become part of dust, of history. But that I think there's a respect for culture as human rights. So, to me, that was the promise of the treaty. There's been a lot of progress around that. Many countries have formalized various structures in the recognition of living cultural heritage, I think originally based on really the Japanese model, and then models like in the United States with our traditional cultural heritage award winners awarded through our National Endowment for the Arts. And other programs have those types of programs that recognize living cultural treasures. UNESCO started the Masterpieces program. Now countries are inscribing various tradition bearers and traditions on various lists of both recognized and protected heritage. And it's interesting, one of our colleagues from the Smithsonian, Frank Proshan, who worked on the festival for many years, is that person at UNESCO who's now doing the writing on the list and watching over people's applications. But I think we all recognize that it's more than just list making. It's more than just government bureaucracies organized around it, although we like the bureaucracies organized around our efforts. We like money that's going for research and documentation. We like attention to intangible cultural heritage because it helps us do our work, and it gives respect to those people who practice these traditions. But I think more so we want to make sure that the treaty enables the kind of things that we hope would happen, do happen around the planet. And that is that the attention to intangible cultural heritage helps in terms of engaging the participation of the communities of practitioners. As James Early, who you'll hear from later, says, there's no folklore without the folk. So, the aim of the Folklife Festival here, I think the aim of this treaty, the aim of many of your efforts, is to make sure that the cultural traditions continue to be vital and robust within their communities, that they don't get frozen in a museum case, but that they continue to evolve and develop, grow with the creativity taken by one generation and transmitted and made anew by another. And so I think we all want to feel that somehow our work, both as scholars, as museum people, as presenters, and as tradition bearers, forwards the concrete vitality and continuity of these traditions over time. And so I hope this group will solve all the issues that people have found in terms of dealing with intangible cultural heritage within their countries and internationally. I hope we'll find answers to issues of over-officialization, over-bureaucratization, lack of resources, lack of community empowerment, and all sorts of other issues that attend to dealing with intangible cultural heritage. But I want to thank, again, all of you for being here. I want to thank my colleagues in different organizations. Our dialogue, particularly with China, has been enhanced immeasurably by the American Folklore Society and the Folklore Society of China in terms of previous dialogues. I want to thank, I think Betsy Peterson, Betsy, you here? Yeah, I want to thank colleagues from the Library of Congress and other agencies who forwarded the dialogue with agencies like the World International Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, in ensuring that the kind of concerns about intangible cultural heritage that we might see ethnographically and even civically are also extended legally through various means so that people have rights over their material and can benefit by their cultural produce. So, without any further ado, other than giving you the charge to solve all the problems of the world and traditional culture in one day, let me introduce the director of the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian, Michael Mason.
Good morning. Sorry about that. There we go. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here to the National Museum of Natural History. And as Richard said, there are a lot of very, very special guests here today, and I'd like to make certain to mention a few. We'd like to welcome the first Secretary of Cultural Affairs, Mr. Zhou Yong, and the second Secretary for Cultural Affairs, Mr. Zhou Li, from the Embassy. And we're very happy that you're joining us today. We'd also like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Ahmed Yassin, the Director General of the National Museums of Kenya, with whom the Smithsonian has a long working relationship, and Dr. Purity Kiura, the Director of Sites and Monuments at the National Museums of Kenya. These kinds of events do not happen without generous support, and in this case we are particularly indebted to the China International Culture Association, who provided the seed funding for this initiative. As part of the festival, they were very generous from the beginning, recognizing the need for this kind of conversation. And that funding was extended significantly by the Consortia for World Cultures and the Consortia for the American Experience here at the Smithsonian. And I'd like to say thank you to representatives from those two organizations. Projects like this at the Smithsonian require an enormous amount of collaboration, and I'd like to thank the co-PIs on the project. If you were a co-PI, could you just stand up? Mary Jo Arnaldi is here from the National Museum of Natural History, Molly Fannin from the Office of International Affairs, Karen Milbourne from African Art, Nancy Mickelwright from the Freer Sackler, and Rick Potts also from Natural History. Thanks. This kind of help is absolutely necessary here to make things happen. I'd also like to just call out Sally Vanderwater in the back. If you could stand up. Sally has actually been the person who made this all come together. Thank you. We've got about just over 100 people here from a number of countries, and we've got approximately a third of the folks are visitors, a third are Smithsonian staff, and a third are Smithsonian staff from the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. The dialogue that we hope to have today really extends what the center is about. We are committed to the sustainability of living cultural heritage and cultural diversity in communities around the country and around the world. And we consistently promote that work through cultural scholarship, traditional artistry, and participation in events like the Folklife Festival and like this more intellectually focused effort. As we work hard to expand understanding of cultural practices and the structures that support those cultural practices, institutions, normative rules, conventions of the sort that Richard was talking about, conversations like this are absolutely important. I remember the fellowships that were sponsored by the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage in the mid-2000s, and the really rich conversations that were had about the kinds of work that was going on at that point and the ways in which people engaged in ICH work were changing conditions on the ground and reflecting on that practice. It's my hope that today we're further along in the process, and my hope is that we will be able to continue in that vein. It's also important to mention that we have strong representation from the South Rift Landowners Association in southern Kenya. Our colleagues are here from the Maasai communities in the South Rift Valley, and this really, to my mind, points to the emergence and the ongoing importance of what the overly academic folks call non-state actors. The fact that we've got a community organization, which we all know is incredibly important in this work, represented here today makes me very happy, because it is that commitment to work with communities which is so essential to the work of the center. The other major issue that I think we'll be talking about today is related to immigration and migration, not just of people, but also of cultural forms and cultural practices, whether they're official cultural practices or whether they're just the living traditions that people carry with them as they make new lives in new places. That transnational component of modern life, which is not new, as we all know, but has been accelerated in recent years, represents a particularly interesting challenge for ICH and those of us who work on ICH. So I'd like to now turn my attention to a few practical things. We do have simultaneous translation into Mandarin and French. If there's a problem with that, you can, if you're having any difficulties, you can come over to the side and speak to the translators team, or you can speak to Sally or one of the volunteers in the back. And again, in pragmatic terms, there are bathrooms around the corner which are available all the time for your use. We will be having lunch up here, and I'm hopeful that the conversations will continue during that time. So thank you again for coming, and I really look forward to this fascinating conversation we'll be having today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Meredith Holmgren. I work at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. I'm currently serving as the principal investigator and project manager of a pan-institutional initiative that investigates intangible cultural heritage here at the Smithsonian. And I am delighted to be here moderating our first panel titled Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage, Vexing Questions, Issues, and Challenges. So I'll introduce our first panelist, Dr. Gao Bingzhong. He is a professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology and the director of the Center for Civil Society Studies at Peking University. He's also vice president of the China Folklore Society, vice director of the Center for Anthropology and Folklore Studies at Peking University, and a member of the expert committee of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in the Ministry of Culture in China. He received his PhD in folklore from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in 1991. Dr. Gao's professional research interests focus on the development of civil society in China, the lives of ordinary people, and institutional efforts to conduct overseas ethnography. His major publications include Blue Book of Chinese Civil Society Development and Folklore and Folk Culture and Civil Society, Cultural Studies of Modern Practice in China. Dr. Gao has also published more than 50 articles. So we are happy to welcome here to be our first panelist. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here, and for me, it's amazing to talk about intangible cultural heritage in America. But I also think it's very natural for us to talk about it in Smithsonian. And firstly, I just want to show you a map. So you can say China is the most, is the greenest part. But, what do you see? Here, it should be America here, or here? Here, right? So it's black, white. It means no element in the UNESCO Intangible Cultural list. And in terms of, I don't know, the color is not right. In terms of environment, here is greener, right? But we have problems with the environment. You can't use the green to describe China now. And I think the map in some way is true. And just as I mentioned, no element for America. So, but it's not the whole story. It's only part of the truth. And we know here, Smithsonian, so you initiated the Folklife Festival even in 1967. At that time, we just had a great cultural revolution. So we destroyed so many cultural values. And also in America, folklorists raised or constructed the great concept public folklore. We love this concept for many years. And it's, so I should, move quick because we don't have enough time to. And from here, and you can see the numbers, how many elements for China to be listed in UNESCO for the masterpieces or representative list of the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. And so I will move to my PowerPoint. And I put too many words in my title. So I want to say too much, but I don't have, I only have 10 minutes. And no, sorry. Why? Sorry. Why is it going this way? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I will move quicker. and keywords. Firstly, I want to introduce you how the Chinese people use some words about folklore. In ancient time, we have this kind of words, feng, shu, okay. It's custom, folkways, but from the modern time, we began to use min shu, folklore. For me, it's a new word, but for many Chinese scholars, they think we have folklore, the concept for 1,000 years. And it's a concept referred to the regional culture or the lifestyle of local people. And it's more stress the geographic side. And but in the modern time, we began to use folklore. It referred to specific culture of specific people. It's typically peasants. It's a culture of peasants. And the elites began to have their own culture, we call it modern culture. And this kind of culture will taught in schools, in universities, and can be found in libraries. And but later from 1990s, so we restarted the discipline of folklore, but we tried to use another word, folk culture, to express our valuation of folklore. I mean, the phenomena, not the concept. And because culture is something higher than folklore in Chinese discourse. And this one time we renaming the folklore as folk culture. And later we know the concept public culture, so we tried to use it. And Dr. Andermin, he's here, and he wrote, I think not only one paper, okay, 2 or 3 papers to introduce the concept public culture into Chinese academy. And I think it's very useful at that time. But later, in the last about 10 years, so we began to use intangible cultural heritage, referring to the kind of items of culture we use before we use the concept folklore, but we still use the concept of folklore, but logically we use the intangible cultural heritage to refer the same thing. And another keyword is public folklore. It has been used in American context. And so I don't need to talk more because you know this concept better than myself. And generally, I think it's a great initiative to transfer folklore into public folklore. And the third word or concept is intangible cultural heritage in UNESCO. And even in the UNESCO, in the beginning they use folklore, but later they changed the word into intangible cultural heritage. About the intangible cultural heritage, Chinese government and Chinese businessmen, Chinese local communities did so many things. And here I just want to talk in 2 ways. One, I will show you a grassroots case and how the village people use the ICH concept to get what they want, and they succeeded. And then I will give a general description of what the Chinese government did. And the case in the countryside located in Hebei province is not far from Beijing, and it's a story about the country people to legitimize themselves from superstition to the normal, public culture or intangible cultural heritage. I think the same thing for me. And for many years, they worship the dragon tabernet. It's very small, very simple, very cheap. But later, they developed their economy. They have more money. They can build, a better tabernet. You say it's different. It's very, very, very beautiful, and it's very typical to talk about the Chinese peasants, villagers. They worship their god or gods. But for scholars, especially with some political standpoint, it's a superstition. So when the villagers did practice their beliefs, they were very, afraid of something from the policeman or from the local government. Later, they built this building for their tabernet or their god. And in 1996 or 1997, and this activities or this item was listed as intangible cultural heritage in the Hebei province level. So they were celebrating their success. So now they can worship in a museum, in a temple. They think it's a temple, but for the people, from the government side, they think it's a museum. So that's why they can build this house legally. And at that time, the peasants tried to protect their own culture. But later, when the item became intangible cultural heritage, the government tried to protect the item. And now they can do what they want to do normally in their daily life. So what protects them or safeguards them is the badge. It's okay. And then I will, from the village, move to Beijing, to the central government. And so you can say from the list so many things the central government and the provincial governments did. Okay. And for law, it's the most important is the national law about intangible cultural heritage. And in 2011, it has been approved. And some institutions even we have a Bureau of Intangible Cultural Heritage and Ministry of Culture. So this morning we just know the central government just put at least 5 independent national bureaus and Ministry of Culture. Now in China, Ministry of Culture is a huge part of the government. So it's much different from here. And we set up the National Cultural Heritage Day. Actually, in the past few years, every year on this day, we had the same thing, just as you did in the National Mall, in Folklife Festival, but the size is much larger. And we did some national survey, so how many resources we have about the intangible cultural heritage in our society. And we built representative lists of ICH and in 4 levels, the central government, the provincial, the county, and between the county and the provinces, there was another level. And so we also honored the transmitters of the ICH nationally and provincially, and many transmitters can get financial support from the government, and also they are, respected in the society now, and not just like before. And we also initiated a new thing, so we call the protection zones of cultural ecosystems, and it's a kind of safeguarding totally, or we use another word, totally, no, it's, how do you say in English about 整体保护, what's the English word? Any help? Yeah, holistic. Yeah, holistic and protection. Holistic protection. We put an area more higher than counties, and many counties they put together. It's a protection zone of cultural ecology, and the focus is intangible cultural heritage, but we expanded the territory to natural environment and the material culture, and we have more. So it's a map of the cultural ecosystems in China. So maybe later, all the China will become green in this, in terms of the ICH. So, but now it's just some points. And what was changed in the name of ICH? I think the most important thing is some change in our ideology and beliefs, folk beliefs, or folklore were treated as bad thing in terms of superstition. Now we tried to give up the concept superstition, and the ordinary people can organize themselves to worship their God, and so they can do this kind of thing and legally, and so wait, I should maybe quicker. And folklore was changed in new names in our society. I just make a comparison before and now, and briefly, folklore become a good thing from bad thing, right? So here I just try to make a conclusion, and before ICH came to China, we had so many crises in terms of relationship between the elites and the common people, between the government and the society. But the ICH create a new space, a new platform for both sides to interact and change themselves, and they can have a new relationship. It's bad, it's good. And that's why I use it to say it's a miracle in China. But I also hope this miracle can happen not only in China. I think I want it happening internationally. That's why I suggested for American colleagues. And for me, American scholars had done great things, just as I mentioned, what the Smithsonian did, what our friends, just like Nick and Robert and other colleagues did concerning the public culture. But I think public folklore is still different from ICH. So only ICH can help us internationally. That's why I use the word world society. We should have a harmonious world society. I think the concept, the idea of ICH can help us. I think that's it. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. Do you have something to tell me? Okay. So I'm going to introduce our next panelist, John Kamanga. John Kamanga is the coordinator of the Southern Rift Association of Landowners. He's the chairman of the Okimarashian Group Ranch and a Maasai elder. Soralo is a community and community-driven initiative that brings local landowners together for conservation efforts and natural resource management in Kenya. Soralo is composed of a number of nature conservancies across the Southern Rift. In 2013, Mr. Kamanga won the 2013 Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens Wildlife Conservation Award, given to honor his conservation leadership. Born and raised herding his father's cows deep in the southernmost part of Kenya's Great Rift Valley, Mr. Kamanga learned firsthand about his tribe's unique ability to live alongside wild animals, including the largest of Africa's predators, the lions. As a young adult, he became elected leader of his Maasai community and started to tap into the wildlife as a resource for his people by setting aside conservation areas and bringing in tourism. Under his watch, the South Rift has become an impressive example of collaboration and integration between researchers, institutions, communities, and disciplines. So I'd like to welcome him now. Thank you.
So as we get the technicians to work on technology things, I would like to ask my colleagues to stand up and in a traditional form that we start every meeting back in my home country and in the Maasai home to do a Maasai prayer. CPTEC, please lead us in that.
Ramayana sergali Washington DC. Ramayana Smithsonian Smithsonian Bye. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is again John Kamanga. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Smithsonian for allowing us to also come and be part of this global society in presenting and in talking about intangible cultures. I come from Kenya, which is in Africa, but specifically from the Maasai community. Which is a community that over time has continued to preserve their culture in areas that are wild, an iconic group. I mean, in coming to Kenya, people have associated the Maasais with the having of wildlife in their spaces. And for us, we see the aspects of intangible culture as the tool that we use to navigate life every day. Yeah, it's impressive sufficiently to see certain items put in museums and all that, but beyond an item, beyond a tool that you see, beyond a beaded piece, beyond the clothing that we wear, there's a story to it. And that story cannot necessarily be told in a museum setup. It can only be told by the people in living their day-to-day life. Of course, our intangible culture is having a lot of challenges currently because of modernity, people going to school. If you look at the photo there, you know, that young boy is herding his father's cows. And in an area that is looking very dry, but yet he's taking all the decisions with him. That is the only resource that the family has. And any mistakes that he makes are mistakes that will go to the family. And therefore, to educate him, to train him, to ensure that he understands what he's doing on a day-to-day basis, from the young age is quite crucial. The challenges today is that we're moving on from that. You know, education has come in where you go to school, you've got a lot of protectors, you've got a lot. The next photo you can see, there are a lot of people behind children, while the other child is walking in the wild alone. It makes a huge difference when communities are able to train their own to be able to live appropriately in life. Sorry. What did I do? Okay. For the Maasai, one of the key things that they use to be able to interpret their cultural heritage, and especially aspects of intangible culture, is livestock. So in those two photos, if you see them, one of them you can see, and I'm sure from your eyes you see a lot of cows. You also see a lot of wildlife, some wildebeest. But from the Maasai eye, I don't see a lot of cows. I see a lot of wealth. I see a big resource. Yeah, I see the source of livelihood for the Maasai. So not in numbers. The Maasais never count their cows. You never count your children. You never count people. It's believed that it brings a bad omen. And therefore, to be able to understand the aspects of how people see things from their own perspective is quite important. But again, this is not something that you can make a representation of. I can't, you know, if you have that photo, yes, but it will be telling different stories to different people. Those things are things that can only be told by the people who own that culture or who have grown up in that culture. The Maasai, in the form that they live, their whole life is through rites of passage. From the early stage, you are supposed to be trained up as a Moran. Moran is, in the Maasai perspective, people who protect their culture. They protect their livestock, right? Anytime you're living in an area that war could erupt any other moment. And therefore, you are carrying your weapons of war. And even in singing, you see them having spears. Yet they're enjoying themselves. But you never know what is out there. They see things from completely different perspectives. You see another one, one is transitioning from being a Moran to an elder. And in that photo, there is a lot that comes. Just beyond a lady, touching some young guy head, there is a big story that is being told there. The story is that, one is making a transition to another age group and into another level in life. And that is the mother shaving off the hair of a Moran. But in shaving that hair, you can see on the side there's a stool. Sorry. There's a stool here. That is a Maasai stool that one is given at elderhood. And that has got a lot of significance in that for your hair to be shaved, milk is used. And you can see that stool is, has got milk on it, because that is what is being used to wet the hair of that youngster as part of that transition. You won't use water. You won't use a cup, as a medium to carry that milk as you are shaving, because that has a lot of significance. That seat, although it's made of wood, but that signifies that the father is seated right next to the son as the mother is doing the shaving, because that seat is what one is given at elderhood, and that allows you now to be able to make certain level of high decisions in life. Livestock is a medium through which we do a lot of transactions. Marriage, can only happen if one has got livestock so that you're able to give it for dowry. Livestock is what we give, as presents. What you see there are goats and sheep that were actually being given to Agnes, one of us here, during her graduation. But you don't get cards. You don't get people bringing you other types of presents. You are given livestock. So therefore, but that only can happen. I mean, for an American today or a Chinese person, if I were to give you a cow or a sheep as part of your present, that might not be the thing to do. But from a Maasai perspective, that is it. That is the best present you can ever give a Maasai. So again, aspects of that intangible culture that you cannot, you can't display it in a museum to be able to show people. People must be there to be able to tell their story, to be able to live that culture so that it becomes practical. Maasais live out in the wild with their cows. They roam rangelands in open space. But that same open space, they actually share with other friends. You can see, so that is a Maasai home out in the wild. But when the Maasais move, because they are a mobile community, when they move out of their homes, look at who is sharing. Wildlife also shares the same space with people, right? I know that people here, you'll think it is intrusion. How can wild animals come to my space? But for us, it's good because they're our friends, and we have got no problem in them sharing the same space as us because we share resources together. You can see there are photos of wildlife with livestock sharing the same kind of resources, same space out in the wilderness. For us, in terms of preserving cultural heritage, that is a Maasai lady. And for us, transportation happens with donkeys. When we move from one home to another, donkeys are what we use to transport our goods. We have such small homes, mobile homes, that you collapse and move on top of a donkey. How do we continue that today when we have a lot of people are able to buy cars and transport their luggages differently? And what we try to do in the Rift Valley is to try and support continuation of the aspects of our intangible culture through creation of a cultural center that we hope to be able to, on a yearly basis, create the platforms that we are now starting to lose for people to be able to celebrate their own culture. Not to be able to display for others, but to celebrate it. Because if you celebrate it, you believe in it. And therefore, you are able to appreciate the value that that culture gives you. Documentation. The Maasai culture, a lot of it has been passed orally. But we are losing our base for oral transfer of culture. Because, children are going to school. They do not have a lot of time with their parents, with their grandparents, so that they are not talking as much as they used to do, which was, again, a means of transfer of cultural values. Possibly to also have a museum. And at the moment, we are working in partnership with the Smithsonian at Olorksale, where Rick Port has done a lot of work over the years, to also have side by side, where we have the story of human origin being told, to have the Maasai also tell their own story in a museum formation, where they could have possibilities of artistic representation through song, through the work of art, through poetry, so that people can then be able to see what it is that different elements, different aspects, different items from the Maasai community could mean. Open space, open rangelands for the Maasai is quite important to ensure that we have continuity of our culture. Because with open space, people are able to relate, people are able to interact and go through the rites of passage together as a team. Globally, people have gone individualistic. Everybody wants to own their piece of land. Everybody wants to own their own thing. With ownership that is changing to individual forms of ownership, the Maasais are quickly losing the medium of transfer of their cultural practices. Promotion of the livestock culture. Livestock has made sure that wildlife is, occupying big spaces of land in Maasai occupied areas because they are friends. We have learned the act of being together. With shrinking space, with land subdivision, we might actually have a reversal of that happening. And when we have a reversal of the cultural element that have supported conservation through livestock, then of course we will lose spaces for wildlife. Policy engagements is also quite an important thing that we engage in, that to try and ensure that simple things like teaching of the Maasai language in schools is passed on to youngsters, because language, we believe, is a major pillar without which you cannot be able to keep cultural practices. So I think that is what we have to share with you today, and we hope for an engaging period together. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, John Kamanga. Our final panelist is Dr. Robert Barron. Is this on? Okay. Oh, thank you. Dr. Robert Barron is the founding director of the Folk Arts Program of the New York State Council on the Arts, also known as NYSCA. Dr. Barron also directs the music program at NYSCA and is on the faculty of the Master's Program in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. He has served as Folklore Administrator of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Senior Research Specialist in the Education Division of the Brooklyn Museum, and Non-Resident Fellow of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of African American Research at Harvard University. Dr. Barron received the Benjamin A. Botkin Award for Outstanding Achievement in Public Folklore from the American Folklore Society, grants from the Werner Gren Foundation, Asian Cultural Council and the Japan Foundation, and a Smithsonian Fellowship in Museum Practice. His research interests include Afro-Atlantic cultures, creolization, cultural policy, the history of folklore studies, and public folklore. He has carried out field research in New York City, Haiti, Japan, and St. Lucia. His publications include Public Folklore, edited with Nicholas Spitzer, Creolization as Cultural Creativity, edited with Anna Cara, and articles in Curator, Journal of American Folklore, New York Folklore, Voices, Western Folklore, and the Journal of Folklore Research. Dr. Barron received his PhD in Folklore and Folklife from the University of Pennsylvania and an AB from the University of Chicago. Let's welcome him now. Thanks.
here. I'm delighted and honored to be here today. Good morning, everybody, and particularly to follow my esteemed colleagues from Kenya and China. Kenya and China are global exemplars for the safeguarding of cultural heritage and enlightened policy, as we see on the community level and nationally as well. Let's see. Oops. Just trying to advance this. How do I advance this? Oh, this is the view. It's got it. Return. Okay, I'm going to be exploring one vexing issue which is pervasive in intangible cultural heritage practice and policy, and that's the question of community participation. And there are many pathways that have been explored, some successful, some not as successful, for engaging communities. I think we've seen a couple of exemplars, as I said today, with the Dragon Tablet enabling community participation and with agency released through the efforts of the Chinese government and the extraordinary work of the Maasai. The UNESCO requires, including, as I'm quoting from one of the documents, communities, groups, and relevant NGOs in identification and definition of ICH, and sees a privileged place for communities in safeguarding. This isn't spelled out by UNESCO, so we find a great variety of practices and interactions among different levels. These variations... Warning. Okay, here we are. There's a great deal of variation with how the state's parties, the governments and national governments, involve communities, and the extent of government hegemony on many levels. I think in the recent past it was felt that government policy was a matter of a national government in a monolithic way imposing policy, but as it's been explored by scholars of critical heritage studies, we see that it's something where there's a variety of different approaches: horizontal, transversal, vertical, and also a great variety with regard to how communities are entrusted with inventorying and the degree of development of community-driven safeguarding programs. And with the creation of the UNESCO schemas, it's very much involved academically trained scholars in the work in inventorying and advising in policy, whereas the involvement of communities in directly documenting their own traditions is generally limited when it does occur. And there's a kind of a continuum with respect to the degree of involvement in inventorying and documentation driven and directed by communities. In France, for example, there's disdain for what's called by some wild ethnology, meaning that research and documentation should only be undertaken by credentialed scholars. In other countries, and we've experimented with this in the United States to some extent, there are community scholars, community members who are involved in inventorying and researching their own culture. And as I said, the multiple levels of government involved in the ICH realm. And so the relationships which crisscross, which are up and down, which are cut into each other at multiple levels, as I said, horizontal, vertical, transversal, with municipal, federal, state, local governments in various kinds of relationships. This is spelled out very nicely, incidentally, in an important book which recently came out in Germany, Heritage Regimes in the State. And with this relationships of governments, there's also the relationships which are created and shaped or not created with community members. And there are wide variations in the degree of agency which community members have in documenting their culture and in safeguarding their culture, the degree to which they're free of government intervention and they carry out their work on their own terms. And often there's a kind of counter-hegemonic resistance of communities to the government heritage regimes, where they will react to policies in some situations. In Europe, for example, there's been a rejection of ICH designations. In other cases, there's been a reframing of policy. And I think we can see, for example, the dragon tablet situation. We saw how Professor Bingzhong spoke about how there was a ICH designation, and the community continued practices that they had carried on for decades, for centuries, but with the help of the ICH designation by the Chinese government, there was an extra kind of validation and support and safeguarding for the practice. And I'd like to talk about the United States. As we know, and as Richard Kurin mentioned, unfortunately, the United States has not been a party, and we haven't signed the Treaty for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Yet we have many decades of work in ICH through public folklore, which covers the domain of ICH safeguarding, but where we've developed our own sorts of practices and policies. One very cardinal point to make, a distinguishing feature of American public folklore, in contrast to ICH and most other countries, is that it's quite decentralized. It's centered in programs in state governments, in folklorists directed and community-based non-government organizations and nonprofits, and it's generally outside of the policy direction of the federal government. We have our important agencies such as the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Arts, but there's a considerable degree of autonomy in the United States. We apply in our public folklore programs for funding for to the National Endowment for the Arts, for example, which is a principal source of support within general guidelines, but there's a great deal of play of opportunity and independence on the part of nonprofits and state governments to carry out their work. One main feature, which has been characteristic of public folklore since it was first initiated 3 decades ago, is that we acknowledge that public folklore inevitably involves intervention, that when a folklorist, or you could substitute the term an anthropologist, another musicologist, another cultural worker, comes into community as either a researcher or a practitioner or a field worker, that the traditions will inevitably change, and the communities also will change and adapt by this, the presence of the scholar or the field worker. It's a kind of Heisenberg effect in the study of culture and the presentation of culture. And acknowledging and starting from that starting point of a recognition of intervention, we stress mutual engagement with communities. And we see folklorists as cultural brokers. We recognize that we intervene. We recognize that there's a change in culture, but we seek in a positive way to assist communities in safeguarding their own cultures on their own terms, with an eventual objective of withdrawal gradually or less gradually to equip the communities, or the communities to take on the projects on their own. So here are several purposes of American public folklore. One is to present folklore to new audiences, the perspectives of both folklorists and the communities represented. So this is what many of us have called outreach and the interest in communities sharing their traditions among each other. Another purpose of folklore works within communities to work with communities to sustain their traditions on their own terms. And the collaborations which we engage in with communities are meant to enable tradition bearers to represent themselves and to mitigate and avoid objectification of the cultures that are represented. So the self-representation addresses another vexing issue, which is not the topic of my paper necessarily, but certainly enters into a lot of considerations. What happens when an outsider represents a culture and when they're displayed to others, and how is the community able to maintain its agency to represent itself without the filter of the mediating party, the expert, the scholar. Public folklore has been dialogic from its outset in the 1980s, and when it began, it was contrasted with applied folklore, which described the work which is covered now by ICH and by public folklore as well. And in applied folklore, as in applied anthropology, is an application of expertise and scholarship unidirectionally in a top-down manner, with the interpretive authority residing in the folklorist who designs programs on the behalf of the community. So it's not characterized by mutual engagement. Now, there's been a change in what's called applied folklore that does involve mutual engagement and service and social amelioration. But from the beginning, it was a paradigm shift in the way that folklorists work with communities to present and safeguard their traditions. And this paradigm shift occurred at a time when a number of other things were happening in anthropology and other fields in the humanities and social sciences. It occurred at a time when indigenous cultures were challenging the epistemological authority of anthropologists, and the communities began to assert control over whether they would be studied at all and how they would be represented. And there was what James Clifford called a dialogic turn in anthropology, which he characterized as an enterprise in which both researchers and natives are both active creators and authors of cultural representation. So there's a notion of shared authority and mutual construction of knowledge there. However, while anthropological dialogism has preponderantly been expressed in scholarship and scholarly writings, in public folklore, and there's a number of reasons for this, because folklorists, to a greater extent than other disciplines, most other disciplines work outside the academy, that public folklore dialogism has been expressed mainly, but not exclusively, in exhibitions and festivals and in media productions and in the training of native scholars to document their own cultures, as well as in scholarship. And just to say a few words about the whole concept of dialogism and the idea of constructing meaning through mutual voices and engaging in mutual engagement. The concept of dialogism by Bakhtin is something which profoundly shapes scholarship in a number of different disciplines. For Bakhtin, dialogism means constructing meaning through multiple voices, and this is contrasted with fixed meaning in monologism, and applying that to the anthropologists, the folklorists coming into a community and presenting the culture without the consent or engagement of the community. That's a more of that's a monologic approach. And reciprocity is intrinsic to dialogism. It's an ongoing process. It involves both anticipation of dialogue as well as response to immediate dialogue in the face-to-face situation. So it's both future interactions and present interactions. Bakhtin's work was with literature, but it's been applied to a number of different realms. So to summarize some features of public folklore dialogism, and then I'll give a couple of examples of exceptional projects which illustrate some vexing issues, but also represent important attempts at creatively constructing dialogism. So first of all, there's the notion of shared authority, sharing representations and interpretive authority with a community. So authority doesn't reside entirely with the folklorist. And this is not something that's exclusive to folklorists. Oral historians have done some important work on the notion of shared authority as well. Programs are developed collaboratively from their inception, from their planning, and they're mutually developed modes of presentation. Cultural conversations, which is a term which was coined with the Smithsonian and was characteristic of so many of the presentational formats that many of you may have seen over the past week and have been carried out for the over 45 years at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Again, equipping communities to represent themselves is another distinctive feature, and engaging community members and traditional practitioners, artists and other practitioners of culture, in developing cultural policies and making funding decisions. So in funding panels such as my own agency, the New York State Council on the Arts, it won't just be scholars. We'll have traditional artists. There'll be community members which we try to have represent the variety of cultural communities in New York State. So both lay scholars and academically credentialed scholars, community practitioners, and artists. And I think this is a particular kind of contrast with policy making in some countries where ICH has been much more directed from the federal government. Okay, now I'll just mention fairly briefly a couple of projects which are illustrative of dialogism. The Surviving Katrina and Rita Houston project began after the disasters and the two hurricanes that affected South Louisiana and Southeast Texas, the Gulf Coast of Texas, in 2005. It's involved folklorists training hurricane survivors to document each other's narrative, to what the directors of the program have called owning their experiences of the disasters and countering mass media distortions. These were primarily, predominantly African-American survivors who were portrayed in the mass media as victims and as criminals. So this project has been a successful effort to provide this sort of agency of interpreting the disasters on the terms of the survivors themselves. The folklorists who initiated the project, Carl Lindahl and Pat Jasper, framed the project structure, and they provided technical direction in creating and curating the exhibition, the technical means of how one goes about doing an exhibition, and the technical aspects of audio productions, which represented the survivors' perspectives. Let's see if I can get... Yeah. We might not have, whoops. Okay, I do not agree. We just have a few minutes. Okay. Well, you can imagine it, and I'm sorry that I don't have such vivid images as the preceding speakers. Lindahl and Jasper took a hands-off approach to interpretation of the project. The survivors were told that they were the experts, so go ahead and make your interpretation. We're not going to interfere with how you interpret the disaster. And Carl Lindahl said that interpretive sovereignty is a guiding precept of the whole project, the idea of eliciting natural narratives with survivors constructing the meaning through the process of collecting the narratives from one another. The stories may not have been true. There were legends, many of them, true in a kind of a historical sense of evidentiary standards of history, but they were accepted through the project because they're believed to be true by the community members and as an expression of their experience. And the idea there is giving primacy to local knowledge, even if it may not follow certain scholarly conventions of history. Okay, the second project I'll mention is the City of Memory Project and Place Manners from the New York City-based organization City Lore. And these are websites of places of local vernacular significance in New York City. The internet is used as a dialogical platform for communicating with communities. It's a means of eliciting and sharing the vernacular knowledge of the places which are important. So the website has many different places included and narratives associated with the places and designation that are made by the community members. And it contains both user-generated content, which was submitted by the visitors, by the general public, and places which are documented by City Lore as the curators. City Lore vets the stories. They appear on the website in a curated form, and they're seen as incorporating both curation, the authority of the folklorists, so the historic preservationists as well, and broad-based participation by the community. Now, just comparing the two projects and then giving a short conclusion, raising some vexing issues. In both of these projects, both the Houston project and the City Lore project, folklorists framed the form and they shaped the technical dimensions and they created the overarching themes of the project. So it wasn't, fully dialogical in that sense. There was curatorial authority that was maintained in both projects. The Houston project stressed the authority of the narrators in interpretation and a strong community role in shaping the direction of the project. It was City Lore, where there is certainly substantial community involvement and engagement and research. They acknowledge openly the curatorial selectivity and their curation of the website. So it's dialogical. They're both dialogical, but I think they show different dimensions of dialogism. They illustrate the value of dialogism enabling community agency as well as a persistence of curatorial authority, and I think this is something we have to recognize when an outsider works with a community. While they acknowledge the power and the framing authority of the experts, any ICH program should endeavor to mitigate and diminish the asymmetries, the power asymmetries, which inevitably come in a project where an outsider is involved. And an objective of projects should be to fully enable communities to take over control of a project as the mediator, as the outside expert withdraws. And I don't think this has really been spelled out and engaged in the UNESCO schemas for ICH, and I think it's a critically important problem and vexing issue moving forward. Finally, reading through Bakhtin as I was developing this talk, I saw some nuances in Bakhtin which raised some vexing issues in my own mind and sort of more fully opened up the question of dialogism. Dialogism for Bakhtin involve creative tensions among utterances, so that both bridges and collisions, any interaction between people, whether it's an anthropologist and the research subject, a marriage, a business relationship, they're both bridges that are built and difference, collisions, as Bakhtin puts it. So there needs to be heightened awareness of the other and recognizing that there are unknowable dimensions of the other, and this will happen in any human interaction and in the process of mediation, the work that we carry out. And so these are kind of uncomfortable facts of life, yet they're essential counters to a monologic, authoritarian, and omniscient, expert-dominated approach to heritage, which does not allow for this agency, which doesn't allow for the voice, and is actually colonial in its nature. So I invite discussion of this issue of what community participation means, the variations of it, and how communities can be enabled to have full agency in ICH activities.
So at this time, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and invite them back up to the table so that we can begin our discussion. So we've heard a great breadth of issues here today, foregrounding our conference here on intangible cultural heritage. We heard Dr. Bingzhong detail how the ICH framework can recontextualize cultural practices that are considered subversive and assign them new national value. We heard Mr. Kamanga highlight how ICH is integrated with livelihoods, livestock, and rites of passages in Maasai communities, as well as connections between culture, land, and wildlife. We also heard Dr. Barron explain how cultural policy regarding ICH work is led by public folklorists in the United States, how it's decentralized rather than spearheaded by national government. He acknowledged interventionism as an inevitable part of cultural policies regarding ICH and related processes of dialogism to public folklore. And invited here to comment on the panel presentations is Dr. Timothy Lloyd of the American Folklore Society. Dr. Timothy Lloyd has served as the executive director of the American Folklore Society since 2001. Dr. Lloyd has served as the executive director of City Folk, the assistant director for the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, director of folk arts programs for the Ohio Arts Council, and as staff folklorist for the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Dr. Lloyd received his PhD in American Studies from the George Washington University. His research interests include American foodways, occupational culture, and the history of public practice in the field of folklore. He's published articles and reviews in major American folklore journals and co-authored Lake Erie Fishermen, Work, Identity, and Tradition. Dr. Lloyd has served as board and committee member or consultant for many organizations, including the French American Foundation, the Fund for Folk Culture, the National Council for the Traditional Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Recording Preservation Board, and the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Lloyd raises funds for and coordinates all of the Society's special projects, including its partnership with the China Folklore Society and other institutions in China, the National Folklore Archives Initiative, the Consultancy and Professional Development Program, and the Society's longstanding relationship with the Veterans History Project of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. He represents the American Folklore Society within the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Humanities Alliance, UNESCO, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. So let's welcome him now.
Thank you, Meredith, and thanks to the Smithsonian Institution for organizing this event. The fact that cultural participation was the keynote of 3 presentations that were not sort of specifically directed or instructed by the Smithsonian suggests the importance of that concept. Certainly in China, in Kenya, in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. And I want to talk about that for just a minute in the context of the presentations that we just heard, and then talk a little bit about some U.S.-China ICH activities in which our society has been involved that connect, maybe provide a U.S. perspective to some of the things that my friend and colleague Bingzhong mentioned from the Chinese perspective. Quite clearly, it's a mistake to look at ICH only from the top down. Communities, artists, tradition bearers use the ICH system for their own purposes, to their own ends. That's not a problem. That's not a shortcoming of improperly conceived government policy that could be solved by more detailed and specific cultural policy. It, in fact, is something that as scholars we have the opportunity and the responsibility to study, but as citizens of our communities and our countries and of the world, we should rejoice in and welcome the fact that there are voices from the ground level sort of engaging with, having dialogue with, and sometimes pushing back against the ICH system. I was struck in particular by John Kamanga's presentation and its use of the terms he used to suggest the ways in which ICH can be a navigational tool for dealing with contemporary life. You know, at the top-down level, you might hear a description of a non-state actor, you know, carrying forward and preserving its own intangible cultural heritage. But at the ground level, you have Maasai and cows. And cows, again, not just as animals, not as head of livestock that can be counted, but as a way of expressing the things that are important in Maasai culture. And the fact that in his presentation, in his community, and through the Soralo organization, open rangeland is seen as worthy of, or seen as a responsibility for protection as well as encouragement of culture and language, suggests that culture, the cultural environment and the natural environment don't just exist next door to one another, occasionally interacting. They're really 2 different ways of looking at exactly the same thing. I was struck as well by Bingzhong's presentation and the fact that part of the miracle, or another aspect of the miracle that he talked about that ICH is or makes available for us and for our communities, is that it can allow sort of conflicting definitions to coexist, or even for the same, for 2 different things to exist in the same place and the same time. On the one hand, you have a museum, which is not a temple. On the other hand, you have a temple, which is not a museum. Yet, they exist at the same time. That's part of the miracle of this, the conversation coming from the community side as well as the ICH system side. That these presentations referred to. So let me take just a minute to talk about what I just told you shouldn't completely do, which is to look at the ICH system from the top down. And I'll talk, as I said, about some U.S.-China interactions. For the last 7 years, the American Folklore Society and the China Folklore Society and a number of partner organizations in both countries have been collaborating on a series of activities to strengthen ties between people and organizations doing folklore studies and ICH work in both countries. And I will say that it is Bingzhong who started that process. This work has made evident some significant differences between the fields of folklore studies and public practice in China and the U.S. that I want to take a moment to mention. During the last quarter of the 20th century, a great deal of Chinese folklore studies focused on the large-scale mobilization of academic and community scholars to collect and publish as much of Chinese folklore and oral tradition as possible. This was in part, of course, as a reaction to the 10-year Cultural Revolution that had taken place just before, and its active campaign to destroy what was called the Four Olds, Xizhou, old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas, to destroy both the tangible and intangible expressions of the Four Olds. U.S. folklore scholars mightily envy the scale of work that their Chinese colleagues were able to undertake during this period, as well as the broadly based academic, community, and government partnership that made it possible. But at the same time, in part because of this focus on the collection of folklore texts, with less attention to the surrounding cultural and social context, this part of Chinese folklore studies only recently engaged with scholarly approaches that have been part of the U.S. scholarly toolkit for some time. Also, since the middle 1970s, and this has been mentioned by several speakers, U.S. folklore studies field developed a very active public sector programs comprising folklore programs in state-based arts and cultural agencies at the federal level and a significant group of nonprofit organizations throughout the country. This sector is now only beginning to emerge in China, but on the other hand, China during the same period has developed a very large number of graduate programs at the master's and doctoral level in folklore studies that has far outstripped what we've done in the U.S. And here I follow along the road that Bingzhong traveled a few minutes ago. Since 2000, folklorists in China have come much farther than we have in the U.S. in their engagement with the benefits and drawbacks of intensive government attention to ICH. It's been estimated that in 2011, the Chinese national government alone, that is not including more local support, provided almost $300 million US for the support of intangible cultural heritage work. That's almost the entire combined budget for that same year of the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. China was the sixth nation to sign the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and as Bingzhong pointed out, it very quickly undertook a successful effort to become the nation with the largest number of ICH items on the UNESCO registry. The U.S., as you know, has yet to sign the convention. The larger political context for folklore and ICH work in China and the U.S. are different in part because of the approaches of our two national governments to matters of culture in general. China, like most nation states, has a central agency in its national government, the Ministry of Culture, to coordinate and manage the government's many cultural programs. The U.S. government takes a particularly decentralized approach. It does not have a Ministry of Culture, and its cultural programs and policies are developed, funded, and carried out by a very wide variety of national government agencies that customarily do not coordinate their work with one another or coordinate it well. This is not to say that all Chinese cultural programs come entirely from the top down, or that all U.S. cultural programs are completely uncoordinated. The reality in both countries, of course, is much more complicated, but each country's approach articulates its larger philosophy of government, and they suggest different degrees of national government belief in the value of culture as an effective arm of national policy. The Chinese government's generous support for ICH work of course, has obligations attached. We would say has strings attached. And some of the work it supports raise a number of critical concerns with which the Chinese folklore studies field is struggling and learning from. These include documenting local traditions for addition to local, provincial, national, and international ICH registries, which often leads to the freezing of these traditions into sanctioned or owned versions, and to the transformation of arts, skills, practices, and their home communities into commodities for economic development purposes. The same issues, of course, would be raised here in the U.S. if our government began supporting ICH work at the same scale here. However, the recent history of folklore studies in the U.S. demonstrates what has often been the unwillingness of U.S. folklorists to engage productively or even at all with these challenges. So we have a great deal to learn from one another, and it'll take time and a variety of collaborative activities to do it. For the last few years, with the support of the Henry Luce Foundation, the American Folklore Society and China Folklore Society collaboration I mentioned has been undertaking several such activities. We're trying to use the lens of the field of folklore studies to explore the cultural sectors in China and the U.S., and in particular those activities that are supported by the government, by private sector and community-based organizations that are intended to sustain tradition-based culture through research, documentation, education, presentation, and conservation. Among our activities has been the production of 4 bilingual binational symposiums, 2 in China, 2 in the US, 1 here at the Smithsonian, that charted and examined and compared folklore and ICH policies and practices in China and the US. At these 4 symposia, 36 scholars, 18 from each country, made presentations on topics ranging from big picture surveys to particular local case studies. AFS and Central China Normal University in Wuhan are collaborating on the publication of bilingual versions of symposium presentations that will be available at the beginning of next year, a permanent product of these gatherings that we hope will extend their value to the academic, arts, cultural, and government community in both countries. And in fact, we are continuing this project by sponsoring a series of conferences and staff exchanges, which will be described later today, for ethnographic museums, or Minsu Bobuguan, in China and the U.S., and the collaborative development of scholarly resources and special education programs for folklorists in both countries. I want to thank the Smithsonian again and our presenters, and let's open this to discussion. Thank you.
All of the microphones are on. Can you turn the microphones on? Will you guys tap the microphones to make sure they're on? It's important for translation and clarity. They're on? No. They're on now? Sounds like it. Okay. Great. So one more time, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Dr. Lloyd for speaking with us today and for grounding our conference here. So join me in thanking them. So we are opening this up now for questions and dialogue with the audience. So we'll start right here. Yes, sir.
Yes, this goes to Timothy Leon.
Looks like we might have an extra here. Is this on? Yes.
Okay, my question goes to Timothy Leon because I was just after hearing from him, seems like this folk life, the traditions of the Americans have been documented for quite a long time, as opposed to what we are trying to do with the Maasai community in the South Rift side of Kenya. We have preserved our traditions, but because of marginalization in terms of education, taking a high toll on us has got a big effect. And I was just wondering, what were the beginnings in America? Because we want to also cope up with that.
The beginnings, guess this one isn't on.
Oh, I think it is. It's just
It is? Oh.
low volume. Yeah.
Great, no monitors up here. Well, I mean, the beginnings of folklore studies in the United States go back a good long way, but there have been instances more recently in our country of, I believe, if I'm understanding correctly, the kinds of things that you're talking about. I'm thinking about, going back to your presentation, and the sort of connection of protecting rangelands and protecting culture being really the two approaches to the same thing. There was a tradition in the southeastern U.S. along the Atlantic Ocean coast of seagrass basket making, where the materials for those baskets are dependent upon the health of the local natural environment, but that natural environment was being threatened by development, essentially recreational and vacation development in that area, and so folklorists, biologists, people from the local community, including artists themselves, collaborated together to try to sort of propose means of sort of responding to the change in the natural environment, such that it could help to sustain this particular expression of culture. That kind of involvement of U.S. folklorists in policy making that connects to specific traditions is somewhat newer in our field and in our country, and really, I think, has been, as Robert had just pointed out, a keynote of engagement of public folklorists with communities over the last 30 or 40 years here.
All right. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir. Microphone is making its way.
Yes, very much of a follow-up. Again, thanks to all the speakers, but specifically brought up in John's talk, John Kamanga's talk, when raising the question, the challenges of schooling and education. I'm wondering if you could speak to the extent to which you think the rising valuing of education among local Maasai communities can ultimately join together and reinforce the valuing of traditional Maasai values.
Thank you very much, Rick. Is this working? Thank you very much, Rick.
Is John's microphone on?
Just switch with mine.
Can you speak a little closer to the microphone? We'll try that.
Thank you.
It's not on. That works?
Thank you, Rick. I think what happens in development is that at a certain point, and this is what has happened in the Maasai community, with the uptake of education, initially the educators, to be able to send or to encourage people to go and learn, was that you got to somehow ensure that people are not taking up their cultural aspects. That is certainly what happened in our community, where you have to demonize the cultural practices so that people then can uptake a new form of knowledge or training. But I think we've reached a critical mass where the communities themselves, the members of the Maasai community, have gone to school sufficiently such that they are starting to value their own culture. And I think that is the turning point, where now we're starting to invest back in cultural values and see whether we can safeguard what we still have. And so we've got people who are studying anthropology. Stephen here is a doctor, and his studies are in anthropology. So being able to, from an academic standpoint, come back and interpret and give back the value that that culture has. So I think we are at that point where it really doesn't matter, because governments also have come to appreciate the value that culture, presents to people. Kenya is a place that is known for tourism, but a lot of people who go to Kenya, one of the attraction point is the Maasai culture. So we both for the purposes of preserving culture, but because of the curiosity that other communities have shown to that culture, it shows that there is a lot of interest, and for sure that has also triggered some interest in us to say, hey, let's go back. I think there's something of greater value here that needs to be preserved for heritage purposes, for the future.
Great. Really reinforcing that notion of cultural participation. Yeah. Are there other questions from the audience? Comments? Yes, sir.
Hi, I just wonder if any of the presenters have seen any of the things in the Folklife Festival these last 5 days, and if there's anything that sort of exemplifies or represents any of the problems that are being outlined here. And if not, I suppose I would ask the same question of any of the people in the audience.
The festival is all about mediation in many ways, and mediation through the kinds of presentations, modes of presentation, modes of interpretation. You have notably, the festival has involved presentation by the practitioners themselves, as well as people with expertise, in an attempt to bridge the cultural difference among the visitor and the person who's displaying their traditions and their variety of styles of presentation at the festival. Some more than successful than others, inevitably, but the festival is quite important in these varieties and modes of presentation. And I guess something I was struck by, I've been going to the festival for a number of years, is that there's a kind of intimate encounter between the visitor and the traditional practitioner, which is often unmediated, which involves by observation, which may not involve language at all, but by proximity and observation and interaction, which is very special.
Thank you. Would anyone else? Yeah.
One of the most striking things I noticed in the China program part of the festival site was the People's Park area. This festival, others like it, are excellent at presenting the performance or demonstration of particular art forms, but sometimes being able to evoke and present sort of larger scale, sort of place-based activities. I'm thinking about the kinds of things that happen in urban parks throughout China that are full of thousands of people doing either their own thing or doing their own thing in groups of ballroom dancing or tai chi or whatever. And I think the People's Park area of the festival the question was about unsuccessful things. This is a successful example. I think was able to capture that same feel of what goes on in those urban areas. Perhaps it's just the case that if you put lots of people together in a shady space on a hot day, they just automatically do their own thing. I don't know, but I think in fact that physical space was a really fine environment for the kinds of activities to happen here across the street that you might see by a lake in downtown Kunming.
Well, one of the presenters mentioned me, just a quick thought, that for some of the performers that there was maybe a reluctance to go into the People's Park because the way that the stage validates and dignifies certain sorts of practices and presentations, and maybe a stigma. So it's not a stigma, but kind of it's not something that occurs on the street. And stage presentations at this festival, some of them were fairly theatricalized. The modes of presentation of troops, and I think in People's Park that there was a spontaneity that Tim mentioned, and that was quite successful, just letting performers out there doing their thing and interacting with people, as would happen in public places in China and many other countries.
I think one thing that I found striking in the festival is dialogue. The whole aspect of dialogue, whether across communities or amongst communities. I mean, I found myself on the same table with a couple of members from, Kenya, the coastal part of the country, and doing certain dialogues, whether it's on cultural differences or values. And even then, even among us who are from Kenya, we found new learnings here in America. So providing people with that space for dialogue, and whether it's cross comparisons of what is happening with the herders in China and in Kenya. Again, a great opportunity for people to be able to see what is happening across the globe.
I want to respond to Dr. Lloyd and also refer to Dr. Byron. And so I have the same impression about the People's Park. It's very like the real life in China. And now the national program about the protection zone of cultural ecology paid much attention to the transmission basis. And it's I think it's a good idea to protect the real space in communities, and it's just a natural part of the daily life in the local communities, and it's more than just protect the transmitters and the items of ICH. It's Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry for my back, but you've actually begun to touch on something I wanted to bring up, and that is the growing role of interest by, certainly I know in the US, but in other places in the world, in understanding indigenous knowledge systems. And so that there's a rising interest in the US in folklore and education, and understanding how that knowledge is transmitted, including the places where it happens, and protecting, as you said, the spaces that learning takes place. So I guess the question that I would have to pose to you all is, how do you see understanding educational systems interfacing with ICH?
Well, as you say, folklore is about informal learning, and certainly the two strains, a few different strains in education, the foundation of education. One is ordained by the education standards that are, I think many communities find limiting, and another is informal experiential learning and discovery, and acquiring a tradition is a process of education with example, imitation, working side by side. And in a school situation, there's informal education that can occur by traditional practitioners, and also in the process of learning anything. So informal education is something which I think education generally could benefit from learning from what we know in ICH and folklore.
I think from the Kenyan perspective and from the Maasai, that's why I talked about the environment, because it's in those open spaces, in that environment where the transmission of cultural practices happens. And yes, it's a process. And therefore, if you start limiting people from the ability of having that space, having the mediums through which that cultural transmission happened, as I talked about livestock in the case of the Maasai, or a lot of pastoral groups where they see the cow from beyond the value of money. If you start losing that base, for sure you start losing a lot of aspects of culture. But the ability to have open space and to continue to have the various items that enable those transactions, that enables people to get together and have common sharing of different resources, continues to build on the different cultures, of course, with the dynamism that comes with the many things that are happening in our environment today.
Thank you for your very good question. And the crisis of traditional culture or folklore is come from the division of the public school and the tradition. And in China, we had private school in ancient time, so the students live with the parents in a village. And from the modern time, we built modern education system. The kids should be trained different from their parents, and more different, more successful for the young generation. But now, from the ICH program on, and the ICH elements or items are welcomed to the school, to the classroom, to the textbooks. I think it's very helpful to do a better transmission. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much. So I have two questions. Looking at the list of ICH items and recognizing how green China is for its 37 items, it seems to me that you could have 37,000 or 37 million items. And one of my, it's curious to me that sometimes whole knowledge systems or whole musical systems are given a stamp, and in other cases it might be just a particular dance. So my question is it better to say recognize livestock in Kenya and the intersection of culture, the cultural and natural environment, and then let people decide, recognize all the folklore and the dance and the music and the material culture and knowledge systems that come under that? Or is it better to target specific music, dance, folklore, poetry, whatever, so those things don't get lost in the sauce? So I guess that's a question for you. And then for our folklorists, it seems it's difficult to get recognition for public work in academia particularly. And your call to step aside and let communities take over is sometimes in opposition to let's write more articles and so forth. And as an educator and someone who wants to inspire young people to be interested and engaged in public work, I wonder if you had any advice or thought on how we can get more recognition for being engaged in public folklore, music, whatever. Thanks.
And when we talk about ICH in China, we may stress that the specific period of China in modern, in modernization, or like this, maybe some people don't like this word. And so we had a period in which all, tradition of the people's values and the people's beliefs were judged bad or should be gave up and totally denied almost. And now the government try to recognize some of the people's culture it's just a very earlier, stage or period. So we may looking for more in the future. So, we are very excited just because the big change is started. And I agree with Dr. Barrett. And so community, the NGOs should be the owners and the transmitters. So they are most important. But in China, they can do something. Actually, they have more time, more resources to do what they want to do since we launched the reform and the opening policy. But the government can do something. It's important in China. But it doesn't mean what the government did can replace what the people did themselves.
Well, I'm sure Dr. Lloyd, is this one on? I'm sure Dr. Lloyd has some things to say about the AFS initiative, which has been done some important work in furthering recognition of academic products other than publications. But I would just mention that co-authorship of publications with community members has a pretty long and distinguished history. So it's that's a classic means of academic validation, and that's something which is possible. There are all kinds of products that come out of it. And I know in the academy it's something of a struggle, but there is a broadening of recognition of community service, public service, and other means of scholarly communication in addition to written publications. But I'm sure you have more to say about that.
Just a bit. The field of folklore studies is a bit unusual in the context of the larger world of the humanities. 40 years ago, all of us sitting in this room who are folklorists would definitely have been teaching at universities if we were working in the field. Academic employment was what there was, but as Robert Barron mentioned, the development of public folklore in the United States is not a minor occurrence. Over the last 40 years, that part of the field has grown to the point where about half of our members define themselves now as working in the public humanities. They're trained in the field like their brothers and sisters on university faculties, but they undertake other kinds of educational challenges with other kinds of audiences. So for public folklorists, the sort of work system and the reward system and the incentive system are different, and so collaboration with community members is much more a natural thing there. There is, of course, then the other half of our field. And AFS and a number of institutions in our field are working to sort of take formal stands ourselves and take formal advocacy positions for the importance of community collaboration and the production of other kinds of work as being countable and to try to assign value to them compared to academic products for tenure and promotion and so on.
All right, well, it looks like we're over time here, but I encourage everyone to approach our panelists, continue the discussion over lunch. So we will be starting lunch soon. We do have another panel after lunch as well as a roundtable discussion, so we're looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Gao, John Kamanga, Robert Barron, and Tim Lloyd. I have a request, some information, and an invitation. My request is, please, each of you received a release form in your information packet this morning, and we would like you to please complete the information and give us your consent to record this. As you can see, we are recording this for our archives, for the Ralph Rensler archives at the center. And the information is, of course, many of us will need to use the restroom during the lunch break. We have some of our center interns available in the elevator bay to take you down to the first floor so that we can use the larger restrooms and washrooms that are available. And now I invite you to please grab lunch, enjoy your colleagues, and continue this invigorating discussion over lunch. Thank you.